Hey guys, today we're going to be taking a look at my new Hyper 7 keyboard. As you might be able to see, it's massive. There are 183 keys, allowing the user to type a ton of macros and symbols. More on those later. This is manufactured by Mech Boards, and the PCB was designed by Yankar. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. This version is from the third production run of the keyboard, meaning it includes the stainless steel top case / mounting plate, the base plate, which is also stainless steel, the screws and standoffs, a blue soldered PCB, and some rubber feet to stick on the bottom. The keycaps and switches I bought separately, and I had to solder them myself, and I think it turned out pretty good. So, little background. The Hyper 7 is partially inspired by another much older, huge keyboard with a ton of buttons, the Space Cadet keyboard. This old keyboard was used in conjunction with Lisp computers in the 1970s, which necessitated the use of something like 4,000 different characters for its programming language. If you want to know more about that keyboard, I highly suggest watching Keystrokes' video on it. I'm not sure how to pronounce his channel name, but I'll link it below. The Hyper 7 really follows in its footsteps by having several modifier keys, including top, symbol, and hyper, in addition to the regular shift, control, and alt. The super key is just a Windows key. These modifiers, if you set up your keyboard and computer correctly, can type a ton of different symbols, like Greek, arrow keys, emoticons, basically anything that you can think of that can be typed with Unicode. This can type. If you like layers and typing goofy stuff, this keyboard is for you. If you don't like having to access layer keys to type unique symbols, this keyboard's also great for you, because you have a ton of dedicated keys that type individual symbols without any other layers. You have a question mark, exclamation point, @ symbol, currencies, quotations, underscore, greater than, less than, brackets, etc. It has a ton of keys. Now on basically every keyboard, even going back to typewriters, the A row is offset a 1/4 unit from the Q row, and the Z row is offset a 1/2 unit from the A row. To keep things looking symmetrical, they decided to offset both of these rows by 1/2 a unit, which, I mean, it looks fantastic. The keyboard is perfectly symmetrical because of that, but it really requires some changes to your muscle memory. I've made errors while typing on this top row, double pressing keys, because it's slightly misaligned from my home row fingertips. And if you're gaming, you'll have to adjust your hand positioning, which is a little unusual, and leads to your middle finger kind of rubbing against your ring finger like that. So something to watch out for, but not a deal breaker for me. Another thing that some people take issue with is this space bar, if you could call it that. This thing is only 1.5 units long, so if you're a person that likes vintage keyboards with a spacebar that takes up the whole row, you probably will not like this. I didn't think I would like it either, but then I started using it, and honestly, my fingers just kind of found it, and it just works. I only ever press spacebar with my left thumb, and my left thumb just happens to rest right there, so it doesn't actually bother me. This key is not a spacebar, it's just another macro key. There are some other weird changes to this keyboard too. You're probably used to your Alt key being the one closest to the spacebar, but on this one they decided to make it the Control key, which is very weird to get used to at first, but if you're gaming, I actually kind of like it. If you're playing a video game that you need to press Shift and Control in a lot of the time, instead of having your pinky doing double the work, your thumb can just slide over from the spacebar to use it instead, and it's actually quite handy. This is another thing to get used to, but really, if you expected an easy-to-use layout, you wouldn't get this keyboard. You'd get a regular keyboard. But you don't want a regular baby shit keyboard. You want the Hyper 7. Look at this thing. Another thing about this, even without a wraparound case, this thing is pretty heavy. The stainless steel adds quite a bit of heft, and having over 200 switches doesn't hurt either. I don't have a scale that can weigh something like this, but I'd estimate it weighs around 7 to 9 pounds. It's not the heaviest keyboard I own, but it's definitely top 3. Moving on to these keycaps. As you might have guessed, a full keycap set for a keyboard of this size and with this many buttons is a bit hard to come by, but I got lucky. There have been a couple runs of Space Cadet inspired keycaps that include keys for the Hyper 7's layout. At least one in SA profile and one in, I think, KAT profile. These keycaps are ridiculously hard to get your hands on now because there were so few sets produced, so I probably wasn't going to get those. The other option, which I went with, was an in-stock option available on pimpmykeyboard.com called Ferrous. These keycaps are in the DSA profile, meaning they have spherical dished keytops, but unlike the steeply angled SA keycaps, these are all flat with no row sculpting of their own. Normally, I like a heavily sculpted profile, but the slanted case really alleviates the boring flat profile, at least aesthetically. These keycaps are made of dye sublimated PBT in a pretty cool light and dark gray color scheme with orange accents. They also came with a key that replaces the F key with the atomic symbol for iron, which is pretty cool. The side effect of using these keycaps is that this keyboard uses exactly 0 stabilizers. All of the keycaps on this main block are either just 1 unit keys or 1.5 unit keys, meaning they don't need stabilization. All of the keycaps up top here, the 2 unit wide ones, do need stabilization, but they use a double switch setup with 2 switch mounts per keycap instead of a central keycap mount and 2 stabilizer mounts on either side. The PCB supports this layout too, in case you want to put 2 keys in place of every 2 unit key, but I like the look of all the 2 unit keys. My solution was to put a dummy switch that isn't soldered in on the right side of every top macro key, and have the left switch be the one that actually functions. This is the default configuration supported by the PCB as well. Now, the switches. As you can hear, it's quite clicky. I figured a keyboard of this size and presence should have a soundtrack that's just as obnoxious. I used a combination of different switches all over the board for some variety. Here's a graphic showing the ones I used. The mint green ones are Zeal Clickiez, the pink ones are box pinks, and the 2 rows of black switches are the fairly new cream Clickiez by Novelkeys. First, the Zeal Clickiez. These are probably my favorite modern switch, which is why I filled most of the main block with them. I'm using the lighter 40-gram weighting switches, but they also sell a 75-gram variant if you prefer a heavy typing feel. These switches have a nice, crisp click thanks to their use of a click leaf as opposed to a click jacket like on an MX Blue or similar switch. They have some upstroke noise from the leaf resetting in the housing, but the click is only on the downstroke. This use of a click leaf also causes these switches to have some pretty extreme tactility, which can be a turnoff for some people. They also offer the ability to remove or change the location of the click leaf, turning the switch into a linear or tactile switch respectively. I've used these switches in 2 other hot swappable keyboards, the Keychron Q5 and the iQnix OG80 Wormhole keyboard. In the Q5, with these tall MT3 keycaps from Drop, the Clickies have a delicate click-focused sound due to the double gasket-mounted design, removing a lot of the harsh bottom-out noise. On the other hand, in the OG80, with its thick polycarbonate case and aluminum mounting plate, the switches have a deep, chunky sound. The Hyper 7 keyboard, by comparison, has a sound somewhere in the middle, with a loud bottom-out sound due to the huge stainless steel plate, but a loud, somewhat high-pitched click sound due to the lower profile PPT keycaps and open case. This keyboard really just amplifies all the characteristics of these switches without muffling or toning them down at all. It's much louder than either of those 2 keyboards also. Between the click, the clack of the bottom out, and the slight plasticky noise of the switches resetting. I like it, but it's certainly a lot of noise. If you're interested in these switches, I suggest watching other YouTube videos featuring keyboards similar to the ones you might build, because these switches really have a lot of sound variability depending on things like your case, your plate, how your plate is mounted, if you use foam or other dampeners, and your keycaps. I bought my Clickiez switches from zealpc.net. I'll link that down below. They have more technical information about the switches, like a force curve, as well as some demonstration videos of the switches being used in keyboards. On the 3 outer blocks, I mainly used Kailh box pink switches. I hadn't used box pink switches before I assembled this keyboard, but I had used box white switches, which use the same click bar design. I was impressed with the crisp, defined click of the white switches, as well as the gentle, tactile feel of them. The only problem was that they click almost as loud on the upstroke as the downstroke, which can be a little annoying for a full keyboard. Plus, their click sound is a little bit high-pitched. For the Hyper 7, I wanted something just a little more meaty. I originally wanted to try some box jades, but they were out of stock when I checked on Novelkeys, so I got pinks instead. These pinks are pretty much perfect for my needs. They have a heavier weighting than box whites, with 65 grams of operating force as opposed to 55 grams. They also have a slightly thicker click bar, which makes the click slightly louder and deeper. This combination of changes also leads to a slightly larger tactile bump around the click event, caused by the slider passing the click bar. As I use my numpad a lot at work, I wanted something different to use for number entry, and these fit my needs perfectly. They also work well at giving a satisfying double click whenever I press a macro key. I would have put them on every 2-unit wide key, but I ran out of them. A few of them are Clickiez switches. Opposite the pink switches under the 2-unit keys, I put some Cherry MX Reds I had laying around. These pinks work fine to lift the keys back up without help, so to make the weighting feel nice, I pulled the springs out of the Reds. For some reason, the Clickie switches tended to get stuck down a lot, maybe because of the strong tactility on the upstroke. Whatever the reason, these switches need the help from the red switches, so I left those alone, and left the spring in them. All of these 2-unit keys feel okay to press, but they bind a bit if you press them on the right side. That shouldn't matter too much, because you won't be pressing them all the time. They work well and sound good for what they are. I bought these switches on Novelkeys.com, linked down below. When I visited Novelkeys' website to buy some box switches, on the homepage I saw something exciting. A new type of Clickie switch I had never heard of before. The Cream Clickie switch. Not to be confused with the Clickiez switch from earlier. Can we please call these something more creative? This is just getting confusing at this point. Anyhow, Novelkeys claims they use a quote-unquote Snapple cap system that produces a satisfying click with every keystroke. A new Clickie switch that also doesn't use a click jacket? Fantastic. I was super curious to learn more about what these switches sounded like, but when I looked up Cream Clickiez on YouTube, there were no videos, so I ended my research there and just bought 2 packs without knowing anything about them. After my order was placed, I kept looking for more information and found a spec sheet on the Novelkeys' store page, which I really should have looked at before ordering. 5 million key press lifetime? That's awful. Modern Cherry switches have a lifetime of 100 million key presses, and even less reliable switches like Alps would last between 10 and 20 million key presses, and they were designed 40 years ago. I had initially planned on putting these switches on all the modifier keys in the main block, but knowing that they may not last, I decided to put them under some keys I wouldn't use all that often. The number row and the symbol row above it. These switches are really interesting. They're very linear and smooth and feel like an enthusiast switch, but just with a click. The click in these switches is about 2/3 of the way down the travel of the switch and has basically no accompanying feel, but they sound really nice and delicate. The sound is kind of similar to the sound you get from a Snapple cap, as Novelkeys said, only much higher pitched and without that satisfying pop. Unfortunately, I've never tried the regular cream switches, so I can't compare Clickiez to those, but this OG80 is filled with TTC gold pink switches. As you can hear, the click doesn't totally take over the sound of the switch. You can still hear the thock a bit. I really recommend these as a beginner's Clickie switch, for people who still want a sophisticated linear switch with an audible thock, but also want to dip their toes into the world of Clickie switches. Just be sure to not do what I did and put them in a hot swap board, unless you love to desolder their switches when they stop working after 5 million presses. Hopefully the lifetime of these switches will increase as they continue to develop them, but we'll have to wait and see. Again, I got these on Novelkeys.com, linked down below. Now, unfortunately, I need to talk about the issues I encountered while trying to use this keyboard. This keyboard uses QMK's firmware to operate, and I do not know how to use that software. I was able to flash the firmware to the keyboard pretty easily, but I haven't yet been able to rewrite any of the keys or macros. I've only had the keyboard for a week at the time of writing this though, so maybe I'll figure it out between recording this and posting this video. So how's the default layout? It has problems. None of these cool symbols actually type by default. If you press a modifier key and a letter, it just outputs a string of letters and numbers that correspond to the Unicode character it's supposed to output. It's a similar story with the macro keys. If you press a macro key, it just outputs a string of letters. I'm pretty sure I'll be able to get this working eventually, but it's annoying that QMK is hard to use. Fortunately, Yankar has posted a screenshot in the MechBoard Discord revealing that the new Hyper 7 will have VIA support. This will most likely be available for the upcoming R4 edition of the keyboard coming later this year, but I hope it's backwards compatible to this R3 version that I have. VIA makes everything so easy. No flashing through some other program, no downloading hex files, JSON files, nothing. You just go to their website, mess around with your key map, and you're done. This brings me to the most exciting part of this video. You might be able to get one of these soon. I was lucky enough to get one of the last remaining R3 boards that David and Mechboards had laying around, but I think they're all gone now. However, they're developing the next generation of Hyper 7 keyboards which offer a few improvements over the 3rd gen. The PCB is slightly different, with certain switches changed to south-facing to avoid overlap, and also hot swap sockets. This is a huge development, because sacrificing 183 switches to this board semi-permanently is pretty brutal. If you're interested in getting the R4 Hyper 7, go put in your email on mechboards.co.uk and join their official Discord. They have a channel devoted to posting sneak peeks of the R4 and answering people's questions about it. They helped me a ton with getting this keyboard and helped me to set it up. Thanks again, guys. I'm super excited for the new one. Overall, I'm super happy with the Hyper 7. This keyboard is unapologetically obnoxious, which is the kind of thing I really enjoy. I enjoy a nice subtle board with reasonable form factor and understated good looks, but every now and then I just want a keyboard that begs for attention, and this one is definitely that. All of the key mapping issues I have with the board are totally fixable with help in the future, and the R4 version should be even easier to use with VIA support. I highly suggest you guys to check out Mechboards if something like this interests you, and feel free to leave any questions you have for me in the comments, as I'm sure I've left out some piece of crucial information. And let me know if you want videos on more weird keyboards in the future, because I have quite a few. Thanks for watching, guys, and here's a typing test where I'll try to use all the different switches on this board.